This is a production of Cornell University.
Okay, great. So my name is Cedric Mason. I work with the New York State Soil Health Initiative, also with David Wolf, who's a PI on the project. And we're working with policymakers, researchers, nonprofits, all types of stakeholders in the state who are interested in soil health to try to improve soil health all across the state of New York, which is a little bit complex because New York has so many different types of crops. So soil health is important because it supports food production for us. Most of the food that we eat comes from soil. It plays a large role in protecting our water resources, and it also has the potential to help us mitigate climate change. So some of the benefits of healthy soil, especially with regard to food production, which we're going to focus on today. Healthy soil has high levels of organic matter, which help retain soil moisture, retain water in the soil for crops to use. It also supplies nutrients for those crops. It feeds an intact soil microbiome, which can include things like earthworms, insects, bacteria, and other microbes. And healthy soil can also function to protect against crop diseases that could negatively impact these food crops. And finally, healthy soil provides a wide range of pore sizes, which are conducive to both water holding capacity and also rooting and drainage. But in New York, a few things can go wrong with maintaining our soils. So when we're driving these heavy tractors over these soils, it's compressing the soil, making it hard and difficult for water and roots to move through that soil. Then what happens is we end up with some erosion that can carry nutrients and sediment off the field into waterways, which has other negative impacts off the farm. And tilling can also result in the loss of organic matter through oxidation and make it difficult for some of these, for the soil microbiome, especially earthworms are impacted by tillage, and some of these fungal networks that can transport nutrients to plants are also affected. So why do we till to begin with? A big part of it is to break up compaction, and that initial tillage creates conditions that sometimes perpetuate the problem. So compaction, if we treat that compaction with tillage, we're burning off some of that organic matter, oxidizing it quickly. We're feeding unhealthy microbial communities. We're breaking apart those soil aggregates that provide the soil structure and provide the drainage that we need. And then that soil gets recompacted and we need to plow again. So we're trying to break this cycle and find other ways to produce the crops that we need to eat and also maintain these other benefits that soils are giving us. So specifically, we're looking at these three practices: reduced tillage, cover crops, and organic amendments, which include compost, manure, and biochar. So reduced tillage has the benefits of preserving the microbiome in the soil, preserves the macropores. We're not disturbing the soil as much. And we're also retaining that organic matter, which stores carbon, provides nutrients to the plants, and also the microbes in the soil. And in addition, off the farm, when we start to look at the impacts of reduced tillage, we're saving on fuel because we're not driving our tractors as much. We're saving on time and labor, and we're saving wear and tear on our equipment. So there's other benefits as well. When we look at cover crops, we're looking at the rooting action of these plants can both break up hardpan, break up compaction. That allows the soil to absorb more water to transmit it to the water table. We're adding organic matter from the plant material that's returned to the soil. If we're growing a legume, like in the bottom left corner, this is a pea cover crop mix. Legumes can provide nitrogen in the soils by absorbing it from the air and through nitrogen fixation. And there's really a wide variety of applications and types of cover crops. And depending on what crop we grow, We can be providing forage for on-farm animals and also producing co-products like, for example, sunflower seeds. But in this climate, we have this long winter, it gets pretty cold, and there's some challenges to getting these crops established and getting the benefits that they can provide, especially over the winter. Only about 10% of New York State cropland is currently cover cropped, or at least it was in 2012. Maybe that number is up a little bit. And there's a challenge to get these cover crops established and fit them in with the rotations of the other crops that we're trying to grow, because corn and soy usually come off, they're harvested in the fall, and that at that point the growing season is winding down, and it's really difficult to get plants established at that point. So there's some research looking at interseeding, which involves planting these cover crops between the rows of corn or soybeans to get them established earlier. And finally, we're looking at these organic matter amendments, where we're taking oftentimes waste products, crop waste or food waste, creating a valuable compost or biochar from them, or in the case of dairy farms, manure. And these can be applied to the soils and adding organic matter back into the soil. And this provides nutrients for the crops as well as the microbes, which in turn help preserve the soil structure. And these also have the benefits of reducing CO2 and methane that might come from improper decomposition of these materials. So what I'm going to talk about today is looking at some of the benefits, costs, and constraints that farmers see when they're trying to implement these practices, because a lot of them are coming from a place where they haven't been using cover crops, they haven't been using reduced tillage, and it's a big challenge for them to sort of change the direction of the ship, so to speak. A lot of times they're running a business. A lot of farms in this country are businesses, so they're trying to make money and trying to pay their bills, just like the rest of us. So we really looked closely with this study, excuse me, we looked closely in the study about at the financial picture that these farmers are seeing. So one of the tools that farmers can use when they're trying to plan ahead and evaluate potential changes in their practices is that they can use this this framework called the partial budget analysis. And the partial budget analysis looks at the expected change in their business that would come about when they use these practices. So it could involve extra expenses that they weren't seeing before. It could involve extra benefits that they weren't seeing before. And so here I've outlined these a bit for you. And we can see the green examples here are examples that would positively impact the business. For example, less fertilizer, less pesticides, that's less money you need to spend on those inputs. Also, we might be seeing greater yields, and that can increase income. So again, it's kind of, we're looking at both the positive and the negative aspects of these changes. And then over here, we see the negative aspects, which might include extra cost for cover crop seed or special planting equipment. And you might have to take some land out of rotation to plant those cover crops and grow them for a year or so to get your soil health going. So we're looking at all these different factors. And so there have been some studies that have used this partial budget analysis and looked at some specific farms. This is an example of a case study that was done by a company called Datu Research on a farm. This is a corn and soybean farm in the Midwest. And so here you can see they did a 5-year study, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you can see that there's an initial cost in this case, kind of an investment, if you will. And then after a couple of years, that investment starts to pay off. And you can track the net benefit here and see that a little bit down the line, there could be some real benefits to this, which is great because these practices also provide these environmental benefits, these climate mitigation benefits. So if we can make these, if these practices can be profitable to the farmer, it can be good for everybody, right? It's a win-win situation. So what we did is we wanted to capture more than one farm in this state. We wanted to capture the whole state. We wanted to identify with this survey, identify the specific costs that farmers were seeing and the specific benefits that they were seeing. We wanted to encompass all of the types of farms in the state, including different levels of experience, different crop types, different systems, organic, conventional, different farm sizes. We actually saw farms from, I think the smallest was like 0.1 acres up to like 5,000 acres. So this is really a broad survey that I'm going to present here. And finally, we also wanted to see how improved soil health might help these farms, help farmers weather the storm, if you will, by being able to sustain crop production in adverse years where there might be flooding or there might be drought. So what we did is we conducted this survey. We distributed paper copies of the survey, which actually, I have some leftovers here. If anybody's curious to just check it out, feel free to just stop by and I'll give you one. And we also used an online platform called Qualtrics, where respondents could access the survey online and just take it from the comfort of their own home, which was actually a really great way to go. A lot of responses came in that way. So we looked at these three practices: reduced tillage, cover crops, and soil amendments, and we asked farmers questions about their practices and the benefits that they were seeing. And statistically, we used the chi-square test to evaluate some of the associations between, say, a cropping practice and the benefits. So we received 182 respondents from all over the state. This is just a map showing sort of the geographic distribution of the responses that we received. We got really a good response rate in a lot of the heavy agricultural areas here. A lot in Western New York. So the response rate correlates pretty well with the agricultural districts across the state. Covered 46 counties, accounted for over 172,000 acres. So the first question on the survey was really, what constraints do you see to crop production on your farm? And this is how farmers answered. So the most frequent answer, actually, they could check off multiple answers, but the most common answer was poor drainage. Second was compaction, and third was erosion. And this is interesting because these are all three constraints that can be addressed with soil health practices. And then you can see others here on the right-hand side too. So we were interested in determining farmers who use these reduced tillage practices, what are they spending their money on? What are the investments required? And also, what are the benefits that they're seeing? So this is the results of the reduced tillage pool. There were 149 responses. And of course, this adds up to more than 149 because a lot of the farms were growing multiple crops with reduced tillage. But we can see that the most popular crop here is corn and soy for feed, followed by grains, oilseeds, dry beans, the gray bar, alfalfa, pasture, hay, basically forage is a big one, and vegetables are very common in the reduced tillage group. So the number one cost that we're seeing these farmers spend, that these farmers are seeing, is specialized tillage equipment. About half of them reported spending money on that, or at least encountering that obstacle. And then along with that, specialized planting equipment. A lot of times, if you're doing reduced tillage, you might be trying to plant through a sod residue, so you need a special grain planter that will help you plant your crops through that. And then if you're reducing tillage, you're eliminating that mechanism of weed control. And so you might be spending more money on herbicides. And then, of course, there are additional components down here: increased labor, lower yields, and other. But these are the three big ones. And so what we did is we compared a couple of different crop types. So the yellow bar here represents farmers who only grow corn and soybeans with reduced tillage. And the green bar is farmers who only grow vegetables with reduced tillage. And then the gray here is the yellow. So we're looking at specialized planting equipment, and we're seeing that overall, around 50% of farmers are using this, are requiring planting equipment, but the vegetable growers really are not reporting that as a cost. I think that really reflects their cropping system. Maybe a lot of them are organic and they're doing transplants by hand, or they can use their existing transplanter. So they're not really seeing that as a big obstacle for them. Another interesting one was, you can see that overall here, increased labor was pretty low. Really only maybe 13% of the farmers said, okay, to do reduced tillage, I need to put in more labor. And very clearly, corn and soy growers are not putting in more labor to reduce their tillage. In fact, it's the opposite for them. But vegetable growers are reporting this expense at a much higher rate. So almost 40% of the vegetable growers doing reduced tillage are saying, yeah, I got to work a little bit harder. Maybe I'm cultivating more often, or I'm hand weeding, I'm moving tarps around, something like that. And this is a pretty significant p-value from our chi-squared test. You can see that's a big difference. So we're pretty sure there's a difference there between the vegetables and the corn and soy growers. Looking at switching to the benefits that these farmers are seeing from their reduced tillage practices. Less erosion and sedimentation repair is a big one. In some cases, if erosion is happening, the soil is basically moving from the field into their drainage areas. And a lot of farmers have to run their tractor and kind of move that soil back. They might have to fix some rills and gullies so that they can drive their equipment across the field. So this is a big benefit for them. 83% said that this was a benefit. And then in contrast to the increased labor that we saw among the vegetable growers, 74% are saying, yeah, I'm spending less on labor, fuel, and equipment. I'm not driving my tractor as much. I'm not driving that tractor myself as much. And then interestingly, over half said, I'm also getting greater yields. So the benefits are real. And then there's also a lot of other ones. Avoided drainage investments, less irrigation. Maybe they're building their organic matter so their soil's holding on to water better. They don't have to irrigate as much. That could be a savings for them. And then looking again at the differences between these crop types, we're looking at greater yields. That was around about 52% overall. You can see here, but maybe not quite as prevalent among the corn and soy growers as it is to the vegetable growers. I'm not quite sure why that is. This isn't actually highly statistically significant, so it could be an artifact, but there could be something there. Looking at lower fertilizer input, corn and soy growers, they're saying, no, I still got to put the same amount of fertilizer on. But vegetable growers are seeing a benefit here. And this is fairly significant here, 0.05 p-value. And then finally, to wrap up this section on reduced tillage, we asked about the profitability. And I think the main picture here is that very few farmers are saying this is decreasing my profitability. So overwhelmingly, the majority are finding this practice beneficial to their business, which is good. So now we're going to switch a little bit and look at cover crops. So just to kind of recap again, the cover crops are planted between crops to protect the soil, feed organic matter back into the soil. And This was the breakdown of our the pool that we saw responding to our cover crop practices. There were 125 farms that we saw doing cover crops. Number one, again, is the corn and soy, and then followed by vegetables, surprisingly. So vegetables are up there, and then grains and oilseeds, dry beans is the gray bar here, number 3, and again, the alfalfa pasture hay, followed by some of these other minor crops here. So prevalent costs and decreases in revenue from cover crops. The big one here is cover crop seed. So I think this indicates very few farmers are actually growing their own cover crop seed, which isn't really surprising. I think that would be a kind of a complicated operation, but maybe some of them are doing it. Cover crop termination is a big concern among people growing these cover crops, because if that cover crop goes to seed and you can't kill it, then that seed is in your soil and it could interfere with your cash crop. So cover crop termination costs, not surprising, that's up there. There's different ways of terminating a cover crop. You could let it winter kill, which is just to let the cold kill the crop. Some crops like radishes winter kill by themselves, so you don't have to worry about that too much. You could mow it, which might kill some cover crops. You could spray it and burn it down with herbicide, and you can also roll it if you're doing an organic system, which has its own challenges. So these are sort of the items that would negatively affect a business that's doing these cover crops. And it's also interesting to look at some of these additional ones too. People might be putting in more labor to get these cover crops in, or spending time learning about how to do it. Cover crops is a pretty tricky thing. The timing is really important. The type of cover crop is really important. So there's definitely some other considerations in there too. And we didn't actually see any, going back to this one, we didn't actually see many differences between the crop types in the costs of these cover crop supplies. So so we can skip right to the benefits of cover crops. So looking at these benefits, less erosion is a big one. 83.9% are claiming less erosion from their cover crops, which, if you remember, that was one of the top 3 constraints that farmers were also reporting. So cover crops are really a great tool to combat this erosion. Cover crops can actually result in greater yields. Maybe they're providing better drainage, and therefore your crop is growing better. It's getting a little bit more nutrient cycling going on in the soil. Could be returning the organic matter. And also lower fertilizer inputs can result from these cover crops. Maybe that's from simply the organic matter that's being built up and returned to the soil, or it could be because they're growing a legume cover crop that's fixing that nitrogen in the soil. And this one really has a whole lot of other minor considerations here. Easier or faster harvest could be a big one. If you can get your equipment in there at the right time because your soil has drained adequately, that could make your life a lot easier. But we did see some more differences between these crop types here with these benefits of cover crops. Looking at the greater cash crop yields, we see overall right around 50% are reporting that, but not as many corn and soy, and a whole lot of vegetable growers are saying greater yields of cash crops. Decreased fertilizer inputs, similar picture. Again, the vegetable growers really responding to that item. And I think this could be due to maybe the types of cover crops that vegetables are likely to grow. I think corn and soy growers, they're probably either taking land out of rotation for a year to grow something, or they're doing a grass like triticale or rye in the fall, to get that overwinter cover, and that's not really providing their nitrogen requirements. And in addition, there's also this consideration of adding this high carbon mix back into your soil, which can soak up your other nitrogen. So it makes sense that these corn and soy growers are not reporting that as frequently. However, they are seeing this benefit, using the cover crops as a source of animal forage. So corn and soy is a big dairy feed crop, right? So these farmers have cows on the farm. They're feeding them every day. They figure, hey, we can grow a cover crop that protects the soil and also feeds the cows. Like that's a double-edged sword, so to speak. Vegetable growers are not really seeing that as much, maybe because they don't have animals incorporated into their system as frequently. And we asked the same question about the profitability overall, and got a similar response. Again, very few are saying this is a not a profitable practice, while a lot are saying, yeah, it's profitable or has a neutral impact. So again, this comes down to the balance of those positive and negative aspects that I talked about with the partial budget analysis, and kind of everything boiling down to, is this investment paying off? And so the second big question that we asked with this survey is, how long does it take to see some of these benefits? So soils generally change pretty slowly. We've all heard the numbers about how quickly soil can be eroded, but how long it takes for us to build topsoil, to build that organic matter back. So we're really interested in finding out how long it takes for those farmers to see that extra income, that increased yield, that reduced irrigation requirements. And what we did is we broke down all the respondents in each of these pools into experience levels from 1 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, 10 to 20 years, and more than 20 years. And we got a good representation across all of those time periods. And we used that to evaluate the point in time at which these farmers are seeing these benefits. So this is probably the strongest relationship that we saw, which interestingly is not necessarily related to soil health, but it is related to income and benefits that these farmers might be seeing. There's several different cost share options out there that farmers can tap into to help cover the costs of doing these practices, because there's policies, conservation policies, that are trying to provide wildlife habitat and protect these water resources. So they're helping farmers do these practices. And interestingly, what we saw was that the highest percentage of farmers accessing these programs are in the most experienced group, whereas it's the opposite with the 1 to 5 year group, which is kind of unfortunate, because what we really want is to be helping these farmers get going and helping them get these practices in place. And that's really why these policies exist, is to get things off the ground a little bit. So I think maybe this reflects the difficulty that some farmers have in navigating these policies and understanding them and understanding how to tap into them. And hopefully this will be useful for policymakers in realizing that they need to do a better job of making these early adopters aware of these programs and getting them involved. We saw a similar pattern with respect to less erosion and sedimentation repair. So this is, again, reduced tillage. So we're not disturbing the soil as much, not breaking up the soil pores, not oxidizing that organic matter. And therefore, we're creating better infiltration, better water infiltration, and seeing less erosion. And we're seeing that grows over time, almost to 100% in these two more experienced groups. But we're also seeing that there is frequently an immediate effect even within the 1 to 5 year group here. So I'd say that's over 60% of reduced tillage practitioners are seeing an immediate effect on their erosion issues. And this is using the chi-score test. We saw that this was a significant association. And then looking at the delay period for benefits of cover crops. So again, this is a little bit of a different mechanism. These cover crops are covering the soil, holding it in place. And interestingly, we did not really see a strong pattern here. You can see the p-value is 0.6. So it doesn't really look like there's an association, but initially, more than 75% are saying, yeah, growing cover crops is reducing my erosion. And that's consistent for the next 20 plus years. So cover crops, this is showing cover crops are immediately effective in reducing erosion. This is another graph looking at these different experience levels here. And we're seeing greater yields among these farmers who have been using cover crops longer. And this could reflect the length of time that it takes those cover crops to impact the soil health in tangible ways. But also we're seeing a bit of that even among the early adopters here. And this is a pretty decent p-value, so we think there's an association there. And this is the converse of that last slide. So this was greater yields of cash crops being more prevalent among the more experienced groups. Here we're seeing lower yields of cash crops more prevalent among the early adopters, but then it quickly drops off. So really none of these more experienced practitioners were reporting reduced yields. It was only in the early adopter group here. So I think those two slides together really complete that picture of the initial investment. Maybe there's an initial cost, but quickly your yields should bounce back and increase. So finally, the third question that we looked at was the resilience that farmers were seeing to some extreme weather events. So we asked them about the ability of their cover crop practices, the reduced tillage, and their soil amendment practices to mitigate really heavy downfall or really heavy rainfall, flooding, and drought. And so here, just as an example of what can happen, heavy rainfall, maybe you'll get a couple inches within an hour, and that can really pretty much submerge your crop if your soil is not absorbing that precipitation. And on the other end of the spectrum, we see here a farmer in September looking at his cornfield that hasn't gotten rain in several months and is severely impacted by a drought. So, so both of these situations could potentially be mitigated with healthy soil. And so the responses that we got were interesting in that a majority, over 60% of farmers who are using either cover crops or reduced tillage are saying across the board, yeah, it's helping prevent flooding, it's helping reduce the impacts of drought, and it's helping reduce erosion. We also looked at amendments here, which referred to mostly manure, compost, biochar, and we're seeing really not as good performance here, not surprisingly. But we are seeing a little bit of drought resilience there from the amendments, which I think is probably a result of kind of the mulching effect and moisture retention that mulch can have on the surface, and also the organic matter that it's adding. So I'm going to wrap things up and mention our website here, newyorksoilhealth.org. We have funding from CALS as well as Ag and Markets, and we work with a wide variety of stakeholders. Just want to mention David Wolf, who's a big part of this study, Matt Ryan, Harold Van Ness are also PIs. Aaron Risto is no longer with us, but he worked with us on this quite a bit. And then we're also working with Johannes Lehman, Thomas Bjorkman, Greg Peck, and Nina Bassett. And of course, many others as well from the NRCS and Cornell Cooperative Extension, not to mention nonprofits, policymakers, people like that. So I want to thank you for coming and try to answer any questions that you might have.
I'm curious if you collected data on kind of planting and termination dates. I was thinking that might explain some of the differences between the veg
and I don't think that was included. I do have, actually, I should mention, I do have copies of the survey. And you can see it's one piece of paper. So it can get kind of overwhelming when you're approaching these farmers and asking them to spend 10 or 15 minutes filling out a form that they don't really have to. And so it's really a struggle to kind of fit everything on here. I think that there were a lot of questions that we would have liked to ask. But you're referring mostly to cover crops, right? So, I mean, what would be the relevance of that in terms of the economic picture?
Well, you saw some differences with cover crops between corn and soy and veg growers. I'm wondering if that was just veg growers, you know, if it was a winter cover crop, it may have a chance to grow longer, right? The main crops harvested earlier, as you mentioned.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the challenge is there's so many different types of farms out there, and they've all got different types of equipment. They're all planting a different cover crop mix into a different cash crop at a different, like it's really complicated. I think that could be really useful if you have a really targeted question and you really target specific, like you could say, okay, say I want to compare the costs and benefits of farmers planting rye or interseeding rye into corn and soy versus a vegetable grower who's taking something out of rotation and planting peas or something, you know, like that's, even though they're both cover crops, they're totally different. So I mean, that's a good point that this really covers everything. And so it's, you know, that's one of the good things about it is it gives us a big picture, but the drawback is we can't really pick out those details with this type of like broad approach, I think. But there's definitely all kinds of opportunities for that.
Another survey-related question. How likely is it that this people who did return the survey are self-selected, who actually have had good experiences?
I think it's very likely. So we advertise the survey through newsletters, which get sent into farmers' email inboxes. So it's very much self-selected. But I did also go to a lot of conferences and farmer meetings where there were maybe 100 people in the room, and we all sort of took some time as part of the meeting to do that. So I think that was a good thing in that it encouraged people who otherwise wouldn't have bothered to fill it out. And of course, you know, like one of the results was 125 of the 182 indicated that they use cover crops, which is totally disproportional to the other numbers of cover crops that we think are out there. So it's good for the survey because we got a lot of responses relevant to these practices. But yeah, I think that is an issue, and I think that really comes into play in terms of those profitability pie charts, because that's not necessarily representative of the entire population. Shannon?
Are you planning to do follow-up interviews, like more in depth when you could ask someone?
Yeah, it's a possibility. I think that would be an interesting way to maybe touch on Peter's idea about getting into the nitty-gritty details of the cover crops that are being used and the more specific methods. Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. Harold?
So, Cedric, I wondered about your category, corn and soy. So there's sort of a category of farmers here in New York that are corn and soybean growers and are primarily grain growers. And then there are dairy farmers who grow corn and typically alfalfa or something else.
Right. So
did you separate those out? Because like with practices like minimum tillage, dairy farm, the needs are different, or cover crops, a lot of the dairy farmers need to plant cover
so
crops.
the categories, I think if I understand your question, you're asking, is silage corn considered the same crop as grain corn?
Right. Are they in the same category? The corn and soybean includes silage corn?
Well, actually what we did is we used, I think, 8 different crop groups here. Grains, oilseed, dry beans, corn and soybean for feed, tree fruit, berry crops, etc. And those were taken from the census categories, I believe. We did specify corn and soybean for feed.
Okay.
So I think that kind of brings up an interesting point in that the language that you use in a survey is really important, because it's up to the farmer to read what's printed on the paper and try to interpret that. So there's definitely a little bit of kind of wiggle room, and maybe a farmer just glances over it and puts it in the other category or something. But I guess grain corn could, I mean, grain corn could be for feed, right?
I mean, the ultimate,
right.
Ultimate place where it ends up, maybe for feed. But I guess the reason why I'm bringing it up is it's for these dairy farmers, when they often have a perennial crop in there already, and then they are applying manure, and it's a lot easier for them to establish a cover crop after corn silage because they have a lot more time. And a lot of them actually are required to do it because of their CAFO plan.
Okay.
And corn and soybean grower, that's a grain grower, and the grain might end up in an animal somewhere, but they are initially selling it to an elevator typically, and then it goes from there. And they have, so if they're growing for grain for corn, corn for grain, sorry, then they have that long season, like you were saying, which is really
right,
a much bigger challenge in terms of using cover crops.
Right. Okay. Does the corn have to dry? Maybe dry down a little bit before it can.
Yeah, I mean, silage gets harvested around this time, and most of it has already been harvested. Grain might stay until the middle of October, and then you might be able to get some rye into the system unless you use an interseeder like what Matt's working on.
Yeah, that's one of the challenges of doing a survey like this, is trying to cover everything, but also not mix things up too much.
Yeah.
No,
it's that's why I'm asking.
Like, for example, berries on here could be blueberries or it could be strawberries. I guess they're both perennials, but strawberries are treated more as annuals than blueberries are per se. So things are kind of lumped together a little bit in ways that might not necessarily make a whole lot of sense, but you kind of have to go with the resources that you have and the space in the paper that you have. But again, that could be a whole other study, is looking at just corn growers and trying to pick apart the different cover crop practices that are out there, for sure. Jonathan?
I have a question about your time domain. You got a lot of responses based upon the performance evaluation for a lot of different things, but the only time domain you have is really sort of experiential on the farmer's part. Do you have anything about when they established the, whatever is conservation, whatever happens to be the practices that they're putting in. So that rather than an experiential timeline, you actually have a practice timeline. So you can have some, so you can look at those types of responses.
I'm not sure I completely understand the question.
So you have a grower who's got 20 years of experience, but they've only established conservation tillage or whatever happens to be for the last 5 years.
Right. Okay. So
So it's been-
yeah. So there could be a difference between how much experience you have versus how long have you been doing this on your farm, right? The way we worded the question, I mean, I actually did think of that, and the way we worded the question, because we wanted to capture the benefits that that person was seeing on the farm that they were reporting for, right? So we asked them to report for their primary farm, which we kind of defined a little bit in the survey. So it could be conceivable that a farmer might have sort of 30 years of experience growing cover crops, but recently relocated to their farm. And so that was kind of a problem that we considered. But the way that we worded it was approximately how many years have you used cover crops on your farm? And we asked them to report the information on the survey for their farm.
And
So-
the response in that case would have been 1 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15. Okay.
Right.
So it's not really an experience of the farmer, it's really an experience of cover crops.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I guess I used that experience as, you're right. Maybe there's a better word for that.
So I actually think that's a better way of getting the data anyway, because it gives you more of a performance on, but
It could be, but then you're sort of also asking the farmer, are they reporting for, this other farm that that they do contract work with, where they plant cover crops, or it just kind of got a little complicated when we started to dig into that issue. But that's a concern for sure, is how do you capture the data that you want, I think. Peter?
Yeah, I was just curious, it looked like there was a fairly high prevalence of cover cropping on perennial crops, so the alfalfa, pasture, hay. I was just curious if you have any thoughts about that, because that seems very surprising.
Cover crops. Right. So some respondents said, yeah, I have cover crops in my forage system, basically. That's a little bit of a gray area, I think, because it could be the cover crop itself. They could be growing triticale as a cover crop, and that is the forage. That was definitely a challenge of the survey, is like, how do we include those? So some farmers, I think, assumed, oh, I've got some hay acreage and I'm just making hay, and that's a cover crop. Like, I'm keeping the soil covered, and somebody else might be saying, oh, I'm actually tilling and then planting alfalfa every 5 years or something, and planting a cover crop in between or something like that. So I think there was kind of everything mixed in to that group.
Okay, I think we should thank Cedric once again.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.